Hey guys, Riceball here. I hope everyone enjoyed their end of the year celebrations and that you guys are starting your 2025 on a good note. Speaking of a good note, we will be doing something different today, which is just a simple announcement of some collaboration frames and a build at the latter half of this video. With that out of the way, let's first talk about the announcement, which is the official release of the Hachidorii XS series and Spezi lovers' Spezilicious RST frames. We've kinda kept this secret, but Spezi and I have been talking over the second half of 2024 about collaborating and making some frames together. During that time period, we exchanged ideas, tried out several duct geometries and printing methods, including multi-material, tried a handful of unique materials, had several calls, and tested a few prototypes, which ultimately led to the creation of the Spezilicious RST frames that come in 65 Pro and 75 Pro format. Now, I've also managed to make a little update to my Hachidorii lineup, which I will call the Hachidorii XS series, which works with the usual 40mm props and will now have a 35mm prop counterpart for those of you who want to go smaller. XS just stands for extra small because these aren't your usual 75 and 65 frames, they're smaller. Instead of a wheelbase of 75mm, it's 68, hence the XS68 in the name. Similarly, instead of the wheelbase of 65, it is 60, hence XS60. The Hachidorii XS and Spezilicious RST frames will all be available in Spezi store, which is quadview.eu, and these are full frame kits that come with everything from the carbon frame, the screw set, and the printed carbon nylon ducts. However, at the making of this video, the Hachidorii XS is not yet out, but will likely be available around mid-January. I also want to mention that I will have a separate announcement for the Hachidorii XS frame, as I'm in the process of making all the necessary documentation such as the rotor builds page, the Thingiverse article and STLs for it, and a proper PDF that will have everything from parts that you can use, the tune, and the build. I was actually inspired by the amount of detail and care put into Kayu Mini's documentation, so I wanted to do the same for the Hachidorii XS. Before we go to the Spezilicious65 RST build, I do want to mention that this isn't your usual whoop build, and I highly recommend watching this whole build section first to give you an idea of how it will come together and the extra steps that need to be done for this very unique frame. It is a very rewarding and great performing frame, but I'd say it's more complicated than the usual whoop build. This is the kit that you will get, which I personally think is nice and simple. It comes with a Spezilicious65 RST carbon fiber plate and the 3D printed carbon nylon ducts. Rest assured though, Spezi does mention that you can still use your Meteor 65 Pro frames if you choose not to go to the 3D printed duct route. However, when using the Meteor Pro frame, you do want to consider that you'll be using it like the older Quattro V4 frame that he had designed before. You also get 2 normal long nylon screws and 3 flathead screws that look very similar to each other. You want to separate these as they do have different purposes, which I will show later in the build. There are also 4 nylon nuts, a cover plate, 2 rubber bands, which is just optional for this build, a battery slot, and some spacers, 4 small ones and 2 long ones. Lastly, it does come with a sticker, which is always a welcome addition. Now let's go over the parts that Spezi recommends and the parts that I will be using. The Spezilicious65 RST frame uses 35mm props, and Spezi strictly, and I mean strictly, recommends the new HQ 35mm props. However, because these HQ props are not available to me right now, I will be giving the new GemFan 35mm props a try. I'm not sure how it compares to the new HQ ones, but it's still a whole lot better than their original 35mm props. You can definitely use 31mm props on this build, but might as well just go to 35mm for that extra prop area. I'll be using these RCN Power 0802 25,000 kV motors, which is from my original Hachidorii V2 build. Spezi actually recommends 0802 for freestyle and 0702 for racing. He also mentioned that you can honestly choose any motor with 2mm stator heights, as this is what Spezi based his duct height on. I do recommend getting the highest kV that you can get a hold on, since you can just lower the throttle limit afterwards. By the way, I've been corrected about this and I want to set it clear. Only use motor output limit if you're using something like 2S on a 1S motor. If you just want to lower kV and make throttle a bit more manageable, use throttle limit instead. You can use any camera and canopy that you want, but know that this frame only supports 3 mounting point camera canopies, and the canopy that it comes with is for the CO3 camera. Lastly, I'll be using Beta FPV's Air G4 5-in-1 flight controller, and I believe it might also fit other all-in-ones, but I need to double check that. Spezi also mentions that the stock BT2 connector is a little too short, so you should opt to either lengthen the one that comes with the Air G4 or solder a custom one on. Now let's go to the oh. What was that? Do I keep that in the video? Now let's go to the build itself. We'll first focus on our electronics. Starting with our motors, one optional thing that I like to do is to swap out the motor wires for some new ones. I think this is a good habit, especially if you're using used motors. Whoop motor wires are notoriously thin, so starting with a fresh set of wires is always a good thing and will prevent future headaches. Here I am just desoldering the current wires, cutting some new wires to length, and soldering it to the PCB on the motors. I'll also add a new heat shrink to cover those joints to prevent any shorts. These wires are around 25mm or an inch, which is just long enough to have some slack to prevent pads from being pulled out, but not so loose that it hits the propellers. I'll also be stripping and thinning the ends of these motor wires at this stage. Next, I will recommend cleaning your frame and ducts under running water. Again, this is just a good habit to do for any frame because there will likely be some residual carbon fiber particles that's not good for you to inhale. At this stage, you can also add your motors to the frame. Or not, you can actually add it later on and then twist the motors, but you'll see that. Next, you'll want to get your all-in-one and add the grommets on it. If you're having trouble, I highly recommend using some floss to help pull the grommet through the mounting holes of the all-in-one. Before we continue, I do want to mention that the all-in-one will be oriented as shown on screen, with the USB pointing upwards and located at the left side of the frame. You'll also want to add your VTX antenna and your camera at this point. After that, you'll want to take 2 flathead screws, pass them through the grommets shown here, and add on a small spacer on each side. Carefully pass these screws through the frame and it should look something like this. You'll want to add the cover plate to keep these screws from coming out, and you may also add nuts to keep these screws secure. You can also trim these screws down at this point. Then we want to add 2 small spacers between the carbon fiber plate before the screws go through the grommets. We're going to take 2 normal screws and we're going to put these screws going up through the frame on the remaining vacant mounting holes on the left and right side of our frame. Again, here we are so far. Your build should look similar to this. At this point, if you're using the same all-in-one, this will be the point where we will do all our soldering. So first twist the motor wires and then join the motor wires to the pads. Don't worry, by the way, we will check if these motors spin the right way later. Next, I recommend attaching your BT 2.0 or A30 connector at this point. Probably just try to estimate how much wire you need since the battery will be right on top of the all-in-one. You'll also want to add your 2 long spacers at this point to the upward facing nylon screws. You can add the battery slot now and just flex it to have access to the USB port, but you can actually just do this afterwards after you put the Betaflight settings on. So, your choice on which one to do first. At this point, I think it's best for us to move into the Betaflight and ESC setup because after putting on the ducts and camera canopy, it will be kind of hard to get to that USB port. Rest assured, There's also a link in the description to the diff file from Spezi that you guys can check out and use. Actually, before we go to Betaflight, there is one thing that I think we should do first, which is our ELRS setup. Now, when you do ELRS setups for these tiny whoops, I highly recommend the 60-second method, as honestly that's been the most reliable for me and for the past few builds that I've had. So while you have your drone plugged in and with a fan pointed towards it, you will want to wait 60 seconds until your drone is flashing like this. If it's flashing, it means it's emitting Wi-Fi, which you can connect to with any device. Using any device, you can go to your Wi-Fi settings, select the Express LRS Wi-Fi, and it should automatically open up a web page where you can put your binding phrase. After that, click Save, and you'll be able to bind to your drone, no hassle. Or it should be. Now we can go to our Betaflight setup. And if you just want to do this very quickly, there is the preset in the description. You can download that, go to your Betaflight and connect your drone. And here in our preset tab, you can go to the upper right and click load backup. After that, you can select the file that you've just downloaded, which is the preset made by Spezi, and you should be good to go after clicking save. But for those of you who are curious of what the different Betaflight settings are for the Spezi65 RST build, I will go through the different Betaflight tabs one by one just to showcase a little bit. So first up, here in our setup tab, we can see if the drone is in its right orientation. Remember, the Spezilicious65 RST has the flight controller in a different orientation than the original all-in-one had. So here we can just verify if it's correct. If I move this forward, our drone should be moving forward, and if I move it backward, it should move backward. If I make it lean to the right and make it lean to the left, it should do the exact same things. Then the same for yaw. If it's not doing that, I highly recommend taking note, writing it down somewhere on how it would react if you tilt it, if you yaw it, and if you roll it. By doing this, we can go to our configuration tab later on and make the necessary adjustments. Now let's move into the parts tab, and if you're using the Air G4 all-in-one, we are using the TBS Smart Audio on UR2, and for UR3, our serial RX. Anyways, here we are in the configuration tab. You can see that my accelerometer is on. This is the reason why you can see our drone react a while ago in the setup tab. We have 8K, 4K on. And you can see here at the right side our board and sensor alignment. So if your drone wasn't reacting the same way IRL as in the diagram in the setup tab, this is where you would make the changes. So as an example, remember that our flight controller is flipped the other way around and is rotated 90 degrees. You can see here that our roll is 180 degrees, so that's flipping it like this, and our yaw is rotated 90 degrees, so that's putting it like that. So that's the orientation of our flight controller for this, and that's how you change the settings in the configuration tab. Here in power and battery, Spezi actually put the minimum voltage to really low, which is 2.95, and the maximum voltage to 4.6. Here is the PID profile settings that you can see in the PID tuning tab. As you can see, he's using custom PID tune, not the sliders, and you can also see the different settings that he's placed on the other parts of the PID profile settings. I'm not smart enough to know what majority of this is, so just take note, this is what's in the preset. These are the filter settings that he has for the Spezilicious65 RST. And if you want to copy my rates, here are my rates. Going to our receiver tab, we are using ELRS, and this is a UART receiver. We are going to select serial if it's not selected already, and then we're going to use crossfire. So here in the boats tab, I just have 4 things turned on, which is arm, beeper, flip over crash, and pre-arm. These are just some basic things that you can do, but if you unclick hide unused modes, there are a lot more things that you can do, including using horizon and angle mode if you're into that. In the motors tab, you also want to double check if your motors are spinning the right way and if your motors are in the right place. Now you can see there's a diagram in Betaflight, and you'll want to follow that and take note of it. After plugging in a battery, you can click the bottom part which says I understand the risk and that you have propellers removed, which you should, and you'll individually spin up these motors and see which one are spinning. If they're not the right ones, depending on the diagram here, you can just click Reorder Motors and it will show you a prompt and some instructions to help you reorder the motors depending on your setup. After that, you can click Save and you'll want to double check if everything is right and check if the motors are spinning the right way. So for this one, number 2 and 3 are spinning in clockwise and number 1 and 4 are counterclockwise. If it's not doing this, you can do motor direction. It's going to show you a prompt similar to the other one, and you'll want to make the necessary changes. Personally, I go to ESC configurator for this, but either method should work. And lastly, here in video transmitter, you'd want to set your band, channel, and power. I usually go for race band 1 and a power of 25 milliwatts. Also here on the right side, take note, it says device ready and it says true. And that's it for our Betaflight settings. The next step is to cut the last flat screw around 5mm long and place it in the front of the duct. And just to clarify, the front and the back of the duct have these cutouts, and these cutouts will be pointing down. You can now place the duct and canopy to the rest of the frame like this. It's a little fiddly, but we're almost done with building the Spezilicious65 RST. The next step is optional, but Spezi advises to put the last 2 nylon screws to hold the sides of the canopy. And lastly, give your ducts a little massage. Like, quite literally, Spezi recommends flexing the sides of the ducts upwards before you use any new ducts. However, for those of you who are using batteries with hard-mounted connectors such as the Tattoo 300s or the Lava 300s, there is one additional step that we have to do, which is trimming the batteries. Now, these batteries have this hard plastic part at the head that is slightly wider than the battery itself, so we need to trim that off, make it thinner so that it could fit in the Spezilicious65 RST frame. The reason why we do this is because the battery head actually hits the propellers, and by trimming it, reduces the chances of the propellers hitting the battery. So I actually made a little tool guide for you guys to use. It's in the description down below in Thingiverse, and hopefully this will make your cuts a little bit more precise and a little bit easier to replicate, as you might have several batteries that you may need to cut down. Rest assured, there are some instructions there, so just follow that and you should be good to go. Before I end this video, I do want to mention a few things about this frame. First of all, this was something that Spezi and I was talking about for the past few months, and something that he was working on alongside my Hachidorii XS. Everything from the ducts, original frame geometry, battery mounting, all his innovation, which I genuinely think no one has done before. However, I'd like to think that this frame is a little bit more centered towards people who have experience in both flying and building. The build is a little bit more complex and involved than a usual whoop, and I will honestly say that you will need to be careful with the propellers hitting the battery. Spezi does strictly mention using HQ 35mm props, which I don't have on hand, so I'm stuck with the gem fans. This isn't really an in-depth review, as I've only flown this for like, I don't know, 30 flights or something, but I noticed that as I crashed more, the likelihood of the battery shifting around and hitting the propellers increased. Every crash that I've had likely resulted in me walking a bit to pick it up and adjust the ducts and battery placement. But again, the centralized battery position is definitely affecting its flight characteristics that legitimately feels nice to fly with. And it's probably the key characteristic when you look at the Spezilicious65 RST. I can see why this aspect was important to Spezi, who has more experience and background in racing. It gives a more balanced feel that corners better than a top-mounted battery, but feels smoother than a bottom-mounted battery. The best of both worlds that further adds on Spezi's tune, which was pretty good. Anyways, that's all we have for this simple video. Thank you again to Spezi Lover for the opportunity for this collaboration and for allowing me to build up one of his designs. It was really fun seeing his design process up close and sharing ideas over the course of a few months. I look forward to the future frames and ideas that you come up with, Spezi. And speaking of frames, Spezi also has his Spezilicious65 RST and my Hachidorii XS series in his store. So if you guys are interested in those, there's a link in the description. With all of that out of the way, I think we're starting 2025 pretty good. Thank you guys for watching, and if you plan to build this frame, let me and Spezi know. We'd like to see your builds. Thank you for watching my build video on the Spezilicious65 RST, and I'll see you all in the next one. Happy New Year's and cheers to 2025! Doing some maintenance on the 3D printer, and I'm just wondering like how flat is the bed, right? I guess not flat. What?